and welcome to another SonicLAB. Today we're looking at the brand new Circuit Tracks. This is the latest, well, it's a sort of upgrade to the original Circuit. Circuit, for those perhaps who don't know, was kind of Novation, well, massive groove box for them basically. Very, very simple to use. Actually pioneered quite a lot of this kind of grid-like interfacing along with push, but also all self-contained. 2 synth tracks and 4 drum sample tracks, plus there were some sidechain tracks. The Circuit Tracks is an update to that, and as such replaces the original one, and it's got a few key differences. Perhaps some of the first things to look at are the main differences. Now, the main differences are this guy has a new case. It's a sort of slimline version. It's got more crafted sides, smaller. It's got an internal lithium battery, which is powered by USB-C and charged. It's not removable. Plus, we've also got no speaker. The original had a speaker, which was actually quite useful. Other key physical differences are we've got large MIDI in, out and through, which is very useful, but we've also got 2 mono or stereo input, and this is for bringing in external sound sources, such as like here I've got the MC101, which I'm bringing in and I'm playing that. There are other big differences as well, because the whole kind of memory side of things has been expanded. We've also got 64 sample slots, used to be 32, but also that sample time has been massively expanded. Now we can get up to 190 seconds of mono sample playback, still mono unfortunately, per project. So that's like, you know, what's that, 3 minutes plus? That's quite a lot of additional sample space. There are a few other things, just sort of key differences. Instead of the sidechain tracks, which used to be next to each of the synths, we've now got synth tracks. We've also got MIDI tracks, which means that we can run 2 external MIDI instruments out via the MIDI out and then bring them back in if that's what we want to do. So we can sequence MIDI stuff here. There's also a change to the way the patterns have laid out, because it used to be there'd be blocks of 8 per group track. Now what actually happens now is if I select a track, I go to patterns, I've actually got 2 pages and they sort of go that way rather than that way. So 4 and 4, and we can do the same thing, which is if we can select patterns and chain them together and kind of create 3 multiples or individual patterns or whatever. There's also another big difference, which is if we go to one of the drum tracks, we've got 32 steps per pattern. So this gives us much broader, a much longer pattern potential. The underlying technology, the actual Nova synth engine, is the same. We get 6 voices per part, all well and good. I think it's been sort of refined and made a bit better sound. In fact, some of the demo tracks in here sound massive. I don't know whether it's me, but the A to Ds just sound, sort of the D to A's that would be, it's just got a bit more kind of like weight and substance to it. Very familiar to those of you who are coming from an original circuit though. They haven't messed around with the interface too much. They've kept it pretty clean. Still got the master filter, which runs low pass, high pass, and we've still got the macros, which we can assign per voice. Again, we can still play our notes via the keyboard, and that can all be set by scales, so not much different there. Let's get a pattern going here. I'm going to start on this bit. The other big difference that we've got, actually I should point out, is in the mixer page we've now got 16 scenes, which what that does is select patterns that are playing. So this is, I come up, this is selecting these patterns. If I come back to my mixer, select this one, this is selecting these patterns. Mixer, these patterns. So we've actually got a way of kind of stringing together different arrangements. We can't record these or sequence these, but it does give us quite a lot of additional scope. So let's start here and I'll press play. I'll bring in another scene. Coming in our 8 bars, it's quite slow. 3, 4. running on because they're one shots. So there's my bass line, which is actually a sample of a track of mine, which was using the Behringer Neutron. So that's one thing that is a little, with all this extra sample time, when we stop the sequence, the samples continue to play on. And a ditto, if you actually change patterns and they overrun without actually putting a volume automation or a sample change volumeation to maybe bring in a sample slot change, it means that they will just continually overrun until they get to the end. So let's take a look at the MIDI setup, because this is kind of the new, shiny new feature. If we come to look at the overhead, MIDI tracks, we can set the MIDI settings, which channels they will send on. And basically, if I just go to this track, the keyboard is now playing via the MIDI out into my MC101 and playing on that MIDI channel, which happens to be a piano that I've got here. I have got another MIDI track here, which is strings, which if I do the overhead, the reason you couldn't hear that is because also when you're using MIDI track, basically works exactly the same note sequence. We can have up to 32 steps, but we also get access to the macros, and the macros basically can be set in the components MIDI editor to send certain MIDI commands. In this case, I go here, this is the filter envelope, so I've got a string on this channel and a piano on this channel. Also, the other thing that we can do is, because we're bringing the sounds into the left and right inputs, I think I've got the piano on one and the strings on another, I pan them left and right hard in the MC101 as two mono sources. We can also add effects to those inputs. So if we go here, effects, I'll play the piano. Let's see, we've got a delay here. Or reverb rather, this is delay. So we apply effects. It's actually quite useful in that sense. But coming back to these macros, as we could say, we can assign them to MIDI controllers, which we can set up templates in our components software. We'll also record as sort of macro, as fader movements like we can on the individual tracks. So on a synth track, we've got the macros here. This is one of my sounds, and you know, I've got this set up to sounds, and these can be recorded against time. So we get the MIDI works in the same way, but with the external. It's actually quite clever, actually, and that works really nicely because we can bring them in. We've got all this sort of self-contained thing. There is a bit of a gotcha though, because I'm using this, I'd rather use this than the internal pad keyboard. The input is coming into the input, but it needs to go through to the MC box so I can hear it, but it also needs to come from the out so that when I've recorded it, it will play. And there isn't really a sort of elegant solution to that. What I've actually done here is I've got the retro kits, I forget the model number, I'll put that on the screen, but this is a sort of merge and splitter. So what I've got is the out and the through coming into this, that's being merged into the output that then goes into the MC707. So I can play on the keyboard and also play from the sequencer. I don't know if there's a way that Novation could fix this in software, but it is a little bit, it's just one of those kind of, it's an old school MIDI problem because we're using MIDI. Anyway, that kind of pretty much sums up the MIDI tracks. You don't get, you can't record controller data in terms of pitch bend or aftertouch. It's just notes and velocity that go into the MIDI recorder. Okay, there is more, because Novation very, you know, what they did is they increased the capabilities of the original circuit many times by adding all this additional firmware. In fact, there has been a firmware update for the circuit track since it was released, which expanded from, I think it was 90 seconds to 190 seconds, I forget what it was, per project. Each project, we've actually got 32 projects in here. We can 64 projects that we can store in here, so that increases the number by quite a lot. We've also got more sample slots, but we've also got an SD card in here, which it doesn't come with the SD card, but we can store entire projects onto that. So we could have 64 I think it's 32 or 64 on the external SD card, and load those in as well. So, you know, which would load an entire sample pack, so all of the samples, all of the patches and everything. But as I was saying, with the firmware, we now get much more of the firmware updates have now been kind of baked in. So we now have legend on the individual pads, and quite often these are done by shift. So we've got shift. So if I'm on the drum track and I press gate, I've now got the ability to see the gate timings. And when I press, you can see each of these steps has up to 6 micro steps, which pressing here, I'm just using the second 3. So I could actually, in this instance, I'm just using the last 3, and that gives me those capabilities. Pressing shift and pattern settings now brings up probabilities. So I can set the probability of that happening within the pattern, 50%, 100%, or, you know, I think that's 10%. I've gone for, I think 50%, because then each time round when I play this pattern, it should next time round it won't play, hopefully. There we go. And this is actually kind of cool because this means that this pattern can have a number of different probability settings. It's a bit fiddly to get to. I have to go shift settings, and then so I've got a 50% probability of that bass drum pickup and 100% of that one, and 50% of this. So there are lots of kind of ways that we can extend the pattern, and that's really good for drum programming. It's not as kind of near the surface as it was with the SQ64 that I just reviewed, but given the interface and the lack of kind of a display, it's quite an elegant solution. But it does mean that we can create these kind of quite complex evolving patterns by messing with the probability and the gates and all these little pickups. So programming is actually, it's really quite intuitive. If we do the same with a synth track, let me just switch that track on. What we get with gate is micro steps. We can have gate length, but we can also, if I press shift and micro steps, means that I can shift each of the notes into one of the sort of 6 sub settings. I can't have re-triggers, but I can actually shift it around. And this also ties into the quantized and unquantized, because when we record shift, we can have quantizing or unquantizing. It's not quite as beautiful as I was hoping, in which case, you know, you can have a totally free recording. It actually breaks each step into 6 possible sub-steps, and you kind of get snapped to one of those. Shame they went for 6 and not 8. 8 would make more sense because it would not give you triplets or swung feels or 6 feels, but that's just the way it is. Speaking of tempo and swing, pressing the tempo swing button gives us the tempo readout, which is in whole numbers. We don't seem to be able to break it down into smaller numbers, though. I guess if you're sending it external MIDI clock or external sync, you could do that. And then the orange knob sets the swing amount from 20 up to 80, so we can get sort of some pretty wacky stuff. I've got this set at 51. Swing feels quite musical, but it's nice. I like the way that they're using this as a tempo readout. I'd like to have seen a bit more of that, actually. I think that would have been quite useful in some other parameters. So components are actually quite a big part of this, and we'll sort of now, let's take a look at that and what that brings us, and also we can take a look at how the sort of samples are handled as well. In fact, if we start with the samples, it's probably the easiest thing. As with the previous circuit, we can actually set a sample per step. So that's my kick drum. This one is another kick drum. Then I've got a hi-hat, so I could just basically choose whatever sample I want. Let's turn that down a bit. Choose whatever sample I want on each step, and I can flip those in real time. And that's the same as the original circuit. And to flip between the banks I've got 4 banks. There's 64 possible sample slots just by paging up and down between them. I think I've got about 25 or something in. And some of these are quite long as let's go up. And here I've got these stems. I think this MIDI channel has possibly got some tuning features because, again, we've got these parameters for each of the, if I go up a couple, we've got the same set of parameters, which are gate length, tuning, there's a distortion, and a filtering. And these, again, are the same sort of parameters, and you can automate these as well across the pattern. If I go down a couple, I'm getting into my longer samples. Which I think are tuned different. And these work in one-shot mode, as I said earlier. You trigger them, they just play to the end, which I understand why they might have done that, but again, it's quite difficult to manage because they'll just overhang. And they'll keep playing unless you specifically either load an empty sample slot to cut it off, or re-trigger a shorter sample, or do some volume automation. I don't know quite how they would handle this, but it feels like, you know, even if I stop the sequence, they carry on playing, and that could be maybe a switchable behaviour, because, you know, you might actually want, when you stop the show or stop the tune, you don't want all these kind of random samples just sort of playing on. And again, because we've got this enormous length of samples in here, there is, you know, you're going to be probably using longer samples. So, you know, I think they probably need to figure out a more elegant way of handling the note triggering or the gate lengths of these samples. Another thing that we've got here, we've got a click function. If I just take these all out, which I guess is useful, that's shift click. Apart from the fact it's really loud. I don't know whether or not it's possible to make that quieter. Nice to have though, always useful when you're recording stuff real time into a sequencer. So I'll just move over here for this because that's where the laptop is. I've got circuit components running on this laptop. It's connected via USB-C to the circuit over there. And this is using Chrome browser because it uses Web MIDI. I mean, this is a web-based interface and it connects using Web MIDI over USB-C. So you do have to have Chrome. That will run on Mac and PC though, I believe. And I'm getting the pack, I'm starting by getting the pack from Circuit Tracks. And this has been running for quite some time and it does take a while. I'm told that it works in the old SysX sample format. So if you imagine 190 seconds worth of SysX sample transfer is quite extreme, but that's just the way it goes. I think when you're loading to and from the SD card, it's a little quicker than this, but it's worth flagging up that this does take quite a lot of time. And that's in both directions. So if you're uploading a lot of samples, you know, go make a cup of tea. And I did find that, you know, I had to maybe have a couple of goes sometimes because with that much sample data, I was getting kind of connection issues occasionally. So, I mean, it could be my cabling, it could be, you know, but I just wanted to flag that up really. So I've downloaded the pack here. This is my sessions. This is the last session that I've got. So let's just take a look at the samples. These are, I'm basically just using, I think I've got 23 samples in here. So there's this one. Oh, you can hear, I can hear this, what this is doing in the browser. So those are, if I lean forward, you'll be able to hear that. And it's really a question of, I'll just go back here just to shut that up. That tells me how much sample storage I've got. I'm using, well, I'm using quite a lot of it. I've got 20 seconds left and I can upload them from local files. If they're stereo, it doesn't make any difference because what will actually happen is it'll just sort of convert them into mono. I think the samples I was using is a mix of 16 or 24 bit. I will check to see whether it will work with multiple sample rates, but I didn't have any issues with the stuff I was uploading. I've just been uploading packs. In fact, I'll make this as a tracks pack so that our Patreon supporters can get hold of it. So if you're interested, join our Patreon. I'll put a little banner below and you'll be able to get that exclusive content. But coming back to this, we've not only got the ability to move samples around, so 64 sample slots, we've got synth patches. I've got a few patches here that I set up, and that's probably a good time to maybe have a look at the synth editor. So if I double click that, if I go to synth, Yes, leave this page. I'm going to get the patch from Circuit Tracks from this pack. This is a little bit clunky. This is a sound that I set up, and it's actually quite a full-featured editor. So we can set up the macros, we've got effects, we've got modulation, and you know, there's 20 modulation slots with all these sort of destinations and modifiers, and then depth, and it's, you know, it's actually kind of pretty good and pretty easy to program synth patches in here. I mean, you do need to do it from this side, but just a quick look again at, you know, we've got these different filter types, we've got drive, we've got filter drive, a couple of LFOs, and the Nova synth engine actually sounds pretty good. You know, I mean, I guess they probably didn't go too crazy on changing things because they want people to be bringing their existing circuit projects into a new circuit. I suppose that makes perfect sense, but maybe it would have been nice to be able to possibly see, you know, higher polyphony count, you know, that kind of stuff would have been welcome. And I'm not sure why I don't know how much they've upgraded the actual DSP in this. I mean, they have upgraded the amount of memory that you get to it, but perhaps they haven't done an awful lot with the actual DSP. And I guess that's, you know, that's just the way it goes. So back over here, there are a few more features that we need to check out. One of the big ones is this scenes concept. So in the mixer page, so I've come to the mixer page, we've got the ability to store pattern settings. I was rather hoping, these are 16 slots, I was rather hoping that we would be able to store mixer settings and effects sends. That would be really cool along with this, but sadly not. What this actually does is create, say if I've got, if I just come here and I've got some patterns selected, let's just randomly select a few patterns at random. And then what I do is I come over to Mixer and I press Shift and I store that into a scene. And that means now when I press this configuration of patterns will happen. If I come back to my Mixer and start here, then I've got a different set of patterns configured. And what this is actually really useful for, it means that we can, they're almost like sort of scenes. Well, that's what they're called, in fact. So pressing 1 will give me a loop round that set of patterns. And it may be that I've got, let's say 3 set here and 1 set here, and that works fine. So what we do is then we just select them. We can't select kind of that one and that one, but we can select a whole set, so the song would run linearly across all the selected patterns and end. And that's actually quite useful because it does mean that we can create song arrangements. The only thing that's a little bit complicated, I mean, because we've got this visual representation, I can't remember, you know, like for instance, I might want to have an empty pattern, and it's probably a good idea to think in terms of, you know, like always having an empty pattern at the bottom of every set of 8, because otherwise it's quite hard to remember what's going on in each pattern and setting up the scenes. As a result, there's a bit of a disconnect, but it's good that we can do this, and it does add an additional bit of sort of performative stuff. And I guess we could also run patterns whereby we've got things like, well, in fact, what I was doing here, I can record patterns in my MIDI tracks, for instance. Let's just make this, yeah, this is 4 beats long. So now if I go into record, I press and hold, I can actually record macros. I don't have to do them real time. This is something I also discovered, but I think this has been around for a while. So step 1, I'm going to open my filter. Step 2, I'm going to close my filter. Step 3, I'm going to close my filter. Step 4, I'm going to open my filter. So now when I play my track, the string sound which is coming in on MIDI channel 1 will give me this sort of which actually is really cool. I quite like that. So we can create these sort of automation patterns that would just be doing stuff to our external gear. And by the same token, we could be automating effects processing on the external inputs using the same method. Now, once again, that sample's going over. One thing I was a bit disappointed, we've still only got these 2 effects, and there are a little bit more kind of interesting modulation stuff, but it would have been nice if there was a way to have a little bit more. But I guess this comes down to, again, the DSP limitations. They obviously haven't put a load more DSP in it, or it certainly doesn't appear that way. And it'd be quite nice to have some more creative effects, possibly with some more parameter effects stuff. Or perhaps we could have had some more effects on the synth voices so that we could process things a little bit more interestingly. I mean, there is quite limited from that department. But remember, you know, as we can process external stuff via the external inputs on the effects, that kind of makes it even more a shame that they didn't go that way. So something else to look at is the sidechain function, because it's still there. Pressing Shift and Sidechain opens up this page here, and what it basically does is it gives us a source track, which is one of the drum tracks, and then a destination, which is input 1, input 2. So on drum track 2, for instance, I've got this kind of pattern here, which is, let's just switch off the bass line, which is this, which I'm just going to turn down so we can't hear it. But now, in the sidechain, there are all these different presets. So we can affect kind of the live input from the sidechain track, and by turning it down in the mixer, we don't hear it. So it's quite a nice creative effect. It's quite simple and basic, but I guess it's useful to have, and we have no kind of control over what these presets do, but we can affect either side with a different drum track. So, you know, we can have it doing whatever we want. Now, one thing that while I was building this kind of project that I was using to demonstrate this I came across the idea of these synth presets. And it's kind of cool because obviously I've got a synth preset here, which I could select the preset from. There are, I don't know how many pages there are. There are quite a lot of pages. There's, I think, maybe 128 patches per synth preset. I may be wrong on that. But it enables me to, if I go all the way up, I'm using this patch here, and I've got a bunch of other patches here. And what I thought is great, because selecting these different patches is bound to be automatable, because in this particular sequence that I've got, I wanted this sound, but I also want that sound for a gated effect. You can't change presets per pattern, and I really have no idea why. We can automate so many things, but we can't automate patch presets in the synth tracks, which just seems like a bit of an oversight, because then because we've only got synth tracks, we could actually have quite a lot of variance and changes for different sections of the songs and flip things around. The only way we can do it is by sending an external program change into circuit tracks. So I suppose if we were using something like a master keyboard in combination, and when we hit a patch, it sent the right program changes to this and then brought out the patches we want, that would work. But it just feels like there's a bit of a missed opportunity there, because that would sort of expand the sequencing capabilities a little bit more, pass it in the same way that we can flip samples on a track. It'd be nice if we could flip presets, but I spoke to Novation and they said they didn't think there was any chance of that happening, because there's something to do with the internal stuff that I didn't really understand. So the original circuit was about £249. Circuit tracks is going to be about 332 rather specifically. So it does represent a little bit more money. However, you won't be able to buy the original circuit once they're out of stock. This is kind of replacing that. And if you're after a groove box, I mean, I still recommend the circuit general platform to people, because it's got so much stuff to offer the beginner. You know, if you don't want to get into computers, but you can sequence, you've got synthesizer, you've got effects, you've got kind of quite a lot of stuff going on. And now with tracks, we've got all that extra memory. I do think they missed a trick by perhaps not upping the DSP, you know, maybe more polyphony and more effects and a few other bits and pieces, and the handling of the synth presets and the way that the samples overhang is still a little bit clunky. But I mean, there's no doubt you could do an entire set on this, and with the SD card you could store lots of big projects in there and kind of fill it up with all of your own sounds, and it's very easy to do that. Anyway, I will leave you with that thought. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to access some of the packs that I've made, or the patches and the samples I've made for this particular session, then please do support us on Patreon. The address will scroll below. I'm just going to play out with what I created using Circuit. That's it for this time. See you next time.